Okay, it should all be up and running now, and you should be able to see my title slide. So firstly, I just want to thank the Department of Chemistry for giving me the opportunity to give this talk today. It's wonderful to be back at, albeit virtually, from where I'm sitting at the moment in a rather tall block of flats in Pinelands. I can see the PD Hahn building, so it feels like it's quite close to home. So thank you for the opportunity. So the topic this morning, the opportunity presented by the call for decolonization. I want to begin, first of all, just by making very clear that this work I do very much in very close collaboration with my colleague Hanli Adendorf. And by agreement some years ago, we decided that whenever either of us presents, we kind of do a co-presentation, because many of these ideas have been kind of developed in partnership with one another. So she's sort of the silent speaker this morning, but all of the work that we've published, we've co-authored in terms of decolonization. So just a disclaimer as I begin, this talk will be the equivalent of a science talk for a popular audience. And what I mean by that is that I'm going to touch into, this work is deeply embedded in education theory, but I'm going to touch into the theory very lightly, because to explain the theory in depth would require a significant amount of time, and we wouldn't necessarily get to where we want to go. But if anyone does want to see the depth of that work, please just contact me. I'll give references right at the end. All of this work is written up, so I'm very happy to share that with you. But also just don't mistake simplification for a lack of depth. I'm guessing some of you will come away from the talk thinking this is a bit of a no-brainer. There's actually a lot of thought and a lot of sort of embedded theory in the talk. The second thing I want to say, or sort of the second starting point, is simply to say that I think that there are three major factors in the discourse in tertiary education at the moment in South Africa. And in some senses, this talk could have started from any one of these positions. So the three positions then are decolonization, the rhetoric mostly pushed by the government around the fourth industrial revolution, which is this idea that we're training graduates for degrees that we don't yet know exist. I mean, for jobs that we don't yet know exist. So it is this idea, essentially, is the idea of training our graduates for lifelong learning. And of course, at the end of this very strange year, there have been major the effect of the COVID-19 pandemic, and the shift to emergency remote teaching has been a major factor. I think all of these, though, point in the direction of a question. It's an invitation to a broader view of what it is that we're doing. And so the question then is this one: what is the value of an undergraduate degree in science? And the first invitation of this talk then is, as I'm speaking through this, to just be aware of your presumptions around what that degree should be, and to allow yourself, again, just to think a little bit wider than perhaps you have been thinking up until now. So decolonization then, obviously the history of this call for decolonization goes back to the Fees Must Fall and Roads Must Fall protests. And I'd invite you just for a moment to notice in yourself as you're sitting listening, how are you responding? What's your thought with respect to the topic? And there's going to be a spectrum of responses there, from thank goodness we're finally actually talking about this, to are we not over this yet? And most people will be somewhere in between that. Secondly, some of you might be thinking about me as a person, and what am I as a white Zimbabwean chemist doing talking about decolonization? And again, you may have a variety of responses to that. And some of you might actually really rather be somewhere else, but feel like you ought to be here, and you're actually distracted by something else. So just to notice that, and an invitation to begin is dare to be as generous as you can as you listen. And allow for the possibility that there may be one point I make which may have some value to you. And I'm inviting you to start from this position, because this is the position that Hanli and I kind of began this work with, and have found it really actually quite profoundly useful. And again, it goes back to sort of historically going back to that notorious Science Must Fall video, where a young social science student from the University of Cape Town was part of a panel discussion and made this claim that we should basically throw out Newton and kind of change to some sort of radically different form of science education. And in discussion with Hanli, one of the things that I began to think about is, well, I don't really want to throw out Newton, but what if I allow for the possibility that the student may have something to say that I need to hear? And that really got us thinking around this sort of idea of the potential of to take the idea of the alienation that some students were claiming to experience. What if we take that seriously? What if we take that as real? What impact does that have? And so we began our work basically beginning to look at how we facilitate a conversation between such students and scientists. And we've written that work up. So I'm not going to sort of go over that work again. But the main point that I want to make today, I think, is an important one. And that is that the decolonization project takes a different shape in STEM environments, that's science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, because the nature of the project of education is different. So this is not to say that we need to think about decolonization, but that our starting point may legitimately be different. And what I'm hoping to do in the next few minutes is to make a case for that. STEM subjects, the central underpinning focus is about conceptual understanding. So what you know becomes vitally important. In the humanities, the focus is much more about a development of a worldview, and therefore it's about orientation to knowledge and orientation to society. So, of course, these things are not actually separate from one another. Every single educative effort has some relation to knowledge and some relation to society. If those of you who have ever seen a talk involving legitimation code theory, you'll be quite familiar with this plane. For those of you who don't know what I'm talking about, it comes from legitimation code theory. I've just adapted it a little bit here. And again, if you want to kind of read more about that, the book chapter that was published earlier this year goes into the theory in some significant depth. Different fields have a different strength of relation to knowledge, as I've said, and a different strength of relation to society. Science tends to sit in that upper left-hand quadrant, where the relation to knowledge is very strong, but the orientation to society is much weaker. The humanities, the relation to society is very strong, but the relationship to actually what it is that you know is significantly weaker. Now, I think the important thing here to recognize is that for us as scientists, we tend, because of the way that our educative system works in South Africa, we tend to be a little bit blind to the way that other fields of education operate. So one of the invitations in this talk is to just think about that a little bit, and to recognize that even though we are favoring relationship to knowledge as being the most important thing here. Nonetheless, there is a relation to society that is operational. And I'll return to that point a little bit later on. The point here is simply to say that these different knowledge fields are legitimately different. There's a second point that I think is useful to make here, and that is around the way in which knowledge is structured. And this comes from the work of Basil Bernstein, which also underpins legitimation code theory. And again, different fields, all educative fields will fall somewhere along the spectrum. Physical science is a very strong hierarchical knowledge, has a very strong hierarchical knowledge structure. So for example, to understand how a chemical reaction works, and if you're trying to understand a reaction in organic chemistry, you must know something. To really understand that reaction, you must know something about bonding. And in order to know something about bonding, you must have some conception of the periodic table. These things are nested. And in order to kind of understand the one at depth, or in order to understand the organic reaction at depth, you are going to have to know the underlying theory as well. Social science, you still have, in social science, you still do have some idea of sort of a depth of conceptual understanding, but you can have multiple different theories and multiple different explanatory tools within social science, each of which can operate independently of the other. So that's kind of what's sitting in the middle there, is you've got sort of multiple different theories could be taught. And if you miss the one semester, you wouldn't necessarily, the next semester wouldn't necessarily build on what you've learned in the previous semester. The humanities then have a much more horizontal knowledge structure where the kind of explanatory power that we're so used to in physical science may be operational on a far less significant level. Obviously, what I'm saying here is a little bit of a caricature, so please don't take offense. If you come from some area of the humanities where conceptual understanding becomes very important, this is sort of, I'm talking in very general terms here. So just again to point out, there is a difference in the purpose of education, and there is a difference in the structure of knowledge. So then if we think about what could happen in terms of decolonization, well, decolonization sort of has been spoken about and emerges really from the humanities, where it's relatively simple to imagine substituting. One could substitute French for Shona, or Shona for French, depending which way you want to think about it, and have achieved a decolonized department. Likewise, you could imagine in literature trading out William Golding's Lord of the Flies for Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart, and hey presto, we've got a decolonized curriculum. Now, I think decolonization is actually a deeper thing than that, but at least, but this is the obvious starting point for the humanities. Likewise, in social science, one can imagine trading out one of your kind of favored theorists for a theory of decolonization or decoloniality, with the hope, I suppose, that ultimately having that module would influence the rest of your curriculum. The problem comes when voices from the humanities or voices from social science start trying to dictate to science what decolonization should look like. And some of the examples would be, well, you know, to begin to incorporate traditional knowledge. Well, that is possible, but essentially what you're doing there is trying to put something in that, you know, we don't talk about social structure in physical science. It's putting something to teach in physical science anyway. So again, if people have questions about more of what I mean by that, I'm very happy to come back to that in the question time. But this is really the point I want to make here, Moving to some of the coloniality literature, this work from Maldonado Torres is very useful in terms of reminding us that regardless of the educative project that we're involved in, there will be three things that we need to take into account: power, being, and knowledge. And what tends to happen in science education is that we forget that power and being are operational at all. It's all about the knowledge. And my argument then today is to say we've got to be very careful here, because being and power are operational, whether we're aware of them or not. And so I've begun to coin this phrase, knower blindness, which again relates back to the work of Michael Young and knowledge blindness, which kind of emerged again from social science in the 1990s. I suggest that in science we are knower blind, in that we tend to be blind to the person of the scientist. And essentially what's happening is that we conflate several ideas to come to this position. Scientific knowledge is objective and socially neutral. I think while some people may argue against that, I'm going to say I'm going to take that as a relatively simplistic starting point, acknowledging, of course, that much of the science much of the development of science as we now know it did happen concurrently with the age of exploration and the colonial era. So these things are certainly linked historically. Nonetheless, an atom is an atom as an atom, and there doesn't appear to have a strong, as such, does not appear to have a sort of a strong social implication of any sort. So again, in a generous reading, let's presume that scientific knowledge is objective and socially neutral, but scientists are not. That doesn't mean that scientists try to remove their bias and that try to remove the way that they operate in the work that they do. But we cannot presume that scientists are just by virtue of the fact that they're scientists, are objective and socially neutral. And if you're not convinced by that, just remember back to a few moments ago when I asked you whether you had any feelings about the topic or feelings about me or feelings about being here this morning. If you responded to any one of those questions, something's happening in you, and there probably is some level of bias operational. The other thing to say is that scientific knowledge is not disembodied. We carry scientific knowledge. At the start of the introduction of the talk, Clive was saying part of the challenge that they have at UCT is that they have a male bias within their academic staff. That actually does make a difference. Not in terms of necessarily the scientific knowledge, but it does have an influence. So I think what happens is that we conflate the neutrality of scientific knowledge with the presumed neutrality of scientists. And that's a dangerous move, and I think it's a move that we can't take uncritically. The second conflation that we make is that science education is not the same as science. Education is never socially neutral. And again, if you're not convinced by that, you may remember probably 2 or 3 years ago now, there was a big push from the government talking about the fourth industrial revolution. And there was certainly a good number of universities, I think of 1 or 2 in particular, who totally jumped on that bandwagon and became sort of fourth industrial revolution compliant. They didn't phrase it that way, but that's what I'm sort of going to say. That the educative project is always socially embedded. Even if we're teaching chemistry, it's socially embedded. So again, we go back to this question of what is the value of an undergraduate degree in science? So what I'd like to do now then, having kind of suggested, I hope by now it's clear that I want to suggest that in terms of science education, I don't think that the best starting point for the question of decolonization is to look at what we're actually teaching. I think we're still going to teach the periodic table. The question is the question I think is a more important question is to look at how power and being are operational in our spheres. So what I'm going to do now for the rest of the talk is going to switch to offering two different ways that I have begun to think about this. Let me be very clear. I think we are simply now embarking on the project of potentially thinking about decolonization. I think to achieve a decolonized science curriculum, whatever that science degree, whatever that might look like, is probably about 10 years away from where we are now. I think it's going to be an iterative process. It's going to take some substantial time. And it's going to take large numbers of the community actually really thinking about this and thinking critically about the way in which power and being are operational in their lecture theatres, in their courses. So what I'm going to do now is offer two different things that I have been playing around with, the one for slightly longer than the other, that operate on two very different levels. And as I say, these are not the answer. This is just illustrations of ways in which we might begin to think about this. So those of you who are hoping to kind of go away with the decolonized science curriculum at the end of this talk, you're going to be disappointed. So I'm going to take quite a big step back here, and you're just going to have to kind of work with me and walk with me through this example a little bit. I think in terms of chemistry education, we're pretty good, and I'd say this is probably true of UCT, probably true of Stellenbosch. We're pretty good in terms of the level of our third-year exam, pretty good at making sure that students have a reasonable conceptual understanding. And we can think about that in terms of really how that works for the most part is this idea of them being able to, the image of the jigsaw puzzle there, of being able to reproduce a particular jigsaw puzzle piece. And UCT may naturally be slightly better at joining the different puzzle pieces together than Stellenbosch, simply because at Stellenbosch we divide our chemistry into 4 different courses, whereas you have a one third-year chemistry course. We have 4. We've got organic chemistry, inorganic chemistry, analytical chemistry, and physical chemistry. So students really can lose sight of the fact that these things are connected. Whether or not that naturally happens in a course, I'm just saying there may be potential there for more integrated pracs and things like that within the UCT structure of the course. The real thing, if we think about ideas like the Fourth Industrial Revolution, where we're preparing students for this idea of lifelong learning, where they're going to need to train further and they're going to need to learn new stuff. One of the things that I'm curious about is, do students know what they know and know the limitations of their knowledge? And this becomes important because if you imagine somebody graduating from UCT and going off into the working world, do they have any idea how to judge when they can say, I am confident that I know how to solve this problem, or I'm completely lost here, the other end of the spectrum, I'm completely lost here, I need to go and find some help? And probably much of what they'll end up having to deal with is something in between those two extremes. I know something, but there's some gaps. So there's some holes in the jigsaw puzzle. do they know how to identify those holes? And do they know how to get back to, how to move to a place where they have some idea of knowledge? Now, that question, knowing what they know and the limitations of their knowledge is not a trivial problem. That goes back to both Confucius and Plato in different ways. Nonetheless, I think we can do a better job of helping students to reflect on their knowledge than we are currently doing. This work comes from the work of Bernard Lonergan, who's a 20th century philosopher. And his main project was Understanding Understanding. And he has these 4 steps of coming to a place where one really does understand. So if we imagine a student coming into a chemistry class, experience is all of their prior learning of physical science, their level of comfort within the lecture theatre, their idea of what it is to be a student in this lecture theatre, and maybe their sense of rapport with the lecturer. All of those things comprise experience and are going to impact the probability of them reaching a moment of insight. Insight is that beautiful moment that we all love and long for in where the student gets it, and you can see that sort of that the penny drops, their eyes light up, and you can see that they get it. And certainly in the past, when a student came into my office, at that point, at the point of that like bright-eyed, shiny-eyed moment, I would go, okay, fantastic, off you go. The question, though, that Lonergan, and it's really at the level of judgment and decision-making that critical thinking begins. Judgment is then to ask whether my understanding is, in fact, correct understanding. And then decision-making is making a decision on the consequences of that judgment. If I do understand, great. I can move on to the next thing. And if I don't understand, well, what do I need to do to help myself? Now, the thing that is not obvious at all in the description that I've just given is that this is in fact not the invitation at this point is to think how our education system is infused by Western individualism. So we think about the person learning this particular stuff, this particular concept, and getting the concept and being able to pass the exam and then taking that off on their own. What's crucial here when we actually begin to look at this Lonergan model is that only insight is in fact truly an individual process. Experience is profoundly socially infused. And so, for example, data experiments have shown that a student who experiences alienation is likely to do worse than a student who feels comfortable in their environment. Insight obviously happens within the being of a single person, so that is a truly individual process. Judgment then requires the student not to say, have I understood correctly, but have I understood correctly within, correctly meaning the way that the community of chemists understand this thing. So in terms of that judgment step, the thing that the student could do to test their understanding would be to talk to their lecturer, or to look at their textbook, or to try some more examples, or to talk to their friends. All of those activities are social activities. It's shifting from just me trying to understand this to me shifting, me moving into understanding as the community understands. And then finally, decision-making, the decisions made by any individual are going to impact the community in some way or another. So, I mean, for me, this really does shift things fairly significantly from just the student trying to do their own thing to the student as becoming a member of the community who holds this knowledge. And that seems like a small shift, but actually it potentially changes significantly what we think we're doing when we're educating. So is education about an individual passing an exam? Which I think kind of unconscious, whether you've even thought about that or not, I think we do tend to think about it that way. Or about an induction to a community. And then it becomes very important to think about how we help those who don't think that they belong. How do we help them? How do we lower the activation energy to their entrance into the community? Again, it really does invite this question around power and being. Notice, though, that what I've done here in this particular example does not erode our idea of conceptual understanding at all. That is still central to the educative project. It's just beginning to think about it. It's just allowing us to begin to shift into that space where power and being are playing a role, rather than exclusively focusing on just the knowledge and this person appropriating this knowledge. It also then potentially does provide a platform where we can have a kind of a much more sense of engagement. Certainly, as I begin to think about this for me as a lecturer, it also shifts for me what I think I'm doing and where I need to be careful. So this is the one example, and as I say, you know, this it's the invitation to revealing how power and being are in play, rather than focusing on the knowledge element. So that's the one factor that I am finding very useful in my exploration. The second one is to recognize that examples are socially infused. I've purposefully used the example of a jigsaw puzzle here because I'm guessing I'm guessing a good number of the people who are sitting listening to this talk will have played with jigsaw puzzles and made jigsaw puzzles as children, may even still do that today. But there may well be people sitting in the audience as well who've never actually used a jigsaw puzzle. And so the very example of the jigsaw puzzle becomes a hurdle to understanding as opposed to facilitating understanding. Now, the examples that we use, the examples that we go on are of course, examples that come from our own experience. And I was one who did play with jigsaw puzzles as a kid. But the crucial thing here is that I can't unembed myself socially. The jigsaw puzzle is a powerful metaphor for me. So what I tend to do in classes now, although COVID has somewhat diminished my capacity to do this, is to say, okay, this is the example that I would use to explain this particular concept. And then say to the class, well, do you have examples that you can use from your experience, and get them to talk in groups of two or three for a couple of minutes, and then get them to share some of those examples with me. And that in itself it's useful to do that for two reasons. One, it's actually quite a good teaching tool because, again, you can say, okay, this example is very powerful because X, Y, and Z, and actually I'm probably going to start using that example myself from now on. Or you can say, okay, this other example doesn't work, and here's why it doesn't work. So it becomes a sort of a secondary way to explain the primary idea. Importantly, though, what that does is it shifts the examples. It shifts my life experience from being normative in that environment to just being my life experience as one voice among others. So again, it's shifting the sense of power, and that it seems like such a small thing, but it really can make a difference. And again, a lot of this is simply about becoming more aware of the ways in which these things are operational. So as I say, at this point, we're 35 minutes in, and most of you are going, well, is she ever going to come to something useful? That was the useful bit. I'm hoping in giving those two examples, which operate on quite different levels, where you've got this sort of this kind of deep reflective process, and this almost trivial trivial example, the use of examples in class. What I'm hoping in giving those two things, I'm giving those two things because they're things that make sense to me and the things that I'm using. But to say the invitation in this talk is to say, well, what is the most obvious starting point for you? Because that actually is going to be the most obvious starting point. And if we all begin to start thinking about this, hopefully maybe a year from now, when there's a community of 20 or 30 or 40 people who have been thinking about this for a year and trying to kind of mold and shape their teaching in response, we'll have a better idea of how decolonization might actually work. So again, the fundamental point that I really wanted to make in the talk today, the starting point of decolonization is legitimately different in the humanities and in STEM. Our main problem in the STEM environment is that we tend to be knower blind, and therefore I think focusing on those issues of power and being will get us much further than focusing on the knowledge as such. And I understand that position is contentious, but that is the position that I take. And secondly, the opportunity that has been afforded by this call for decolonization is this deep question of what is the purpose of our degree. It must be about sound conceptual understanding. But if it's only about that, I think we're really doing a disservice to our students. I think there's a lot more that we can think about. And I'm really hoping that if nothing else, what I've invited you to think about this morning is that broader sense of the purpose of the degree. So I'll end again where I began, just giving thanks to my colleague, Dr. Hanni Ardendorf. And this is sort of some of the places where this work has been written up. It's been actually very fun and exciting working on this book, Decolonizing Knowledge and Knowers, with a group of people from around the country. I think we've all learned a lot in the process. And it's so that book will be out, should be out in April next year, but I'm not quite, that publication date may have shifted slightly. So I think that's all I have to say. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and open up for questions.